Hi, everyone. I'm David Bowles. I am a professor at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, which is in the United States, in deep South Texas, on the border with Mexico, which is another of the countries that I live in. I live in the US and in Mexico. And so a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about this morning come from my experiences as an educator and scholar of education in North America, but I think that they have validity globally, and hopefully you will find some things to inspire you and get you thinking about the direction in which we're headed with education, especially in the wake of the pandemic. I've labeled this talk "Learning in Community: Place-Rooted Education in an Interconnected World." And we'll dive in. In order to talk about the cracks in education that have been widened by the pandemic and have been made more obvious, I want to very quickly walk us through the things that we already understood about education and where we came from. So, public education in the West evolved from the Greek and Roman model, which was an elite model that was principally centered around males of the landowner class. So basically, wealthy people, wealthy males. And a lot of the pedagogical underpinnings of modern Western education come from these systems with very little modification. Once democracy began to spread through Europe and North America, and then industrialism came along as well, restrictions were placed on child labor, and there was this need to do something with children when they were, preteens and teenagers, when normally they would have been working. And so by the end of the 19th century, we began this great experiment, something that had never been done in the entire history of humanity, and that was mandatory schooling for all children, regardless of gender or age or social class. And we're still in the midst of that experiment. And to some extent, we are making things up as we go and learning as we go. And we've made great many mistakes along the way. And some of those mistakes derive from the social complications of public education in that like classical model that's thrust then upon everybody in a society. One of the major complications is the role of the nation state in education. So, nation state, I'm using it in the terms of a country that is generally driven by, controlled by a single ethnic or racial group of people. And they may be the majority or essentially the only people in that country, or they may be sometimes a ruling minority. But in a nation state, their values and views are the ones that are imposed through the educational system. And in countries like Mexico and the US, there's definitely, even though arguably neither of those countries are nation states, there has been a desire by elites to treat them as nation states. And then another complicating factor has been corporate capitalism and what corporations want from public schooling, which is essentially, um, you know, trained labor, relatively cheap trained labor. Um, Religion has also played a part in shaping like the ethos of schooling, the kinds of values that are perpetuated by schooling. And in the US and Mexico, there's long been the struggle, more so in the US and Mexico, which is very federally controlled, between local and then either provincial, state in the US, or federal control. There's been this tendency of local organisms in the United States. We have what are called school boards that have some like local oversight of education, to see any kind of oversight by the federal government as an erasure of their own, autonomy locally. And inversely, there's been a tendency of the federal government to impose this single system that I've been talking about on the local communities that might have different values or different things that they're trying to accomplish, or different needs in terms of a workforce and so forth. Um, because of that top-down system, because of this conflict, there's been a real lack of connection uh, between the school system, as overseen by the federal government, and what we call local funds of knowledge. Funds of knowledge being the places that certain subgroups, ethnic groups, racial groups, marginalized groups of any sort, derive alternate skills and knowledge from. These may be, your local shaman, local healers, or people that work medicine in different ways, and they can just be experts within the community that know particular skills that are of essential value to that community. And so schools tend not to tap into that because they are using this top-down homogenous approach that erases the particularities of the knowledge base of each community. And by erasing them, by disconnecting them from the students in that community, they essentially are making a value judgment about the lives of the children in that community. If those children are not aligned with the the culture of power that controls the nation state. And as a result, there's this lack of two of the three R's that are really essential for student success and education. Those three R's are normally are called relevance, relationships, and rigor. And when you have a top-down system like this that ignores or minimizes any kind of local input into what is taught and how it's taught and who teaches it, then those first two, relevance, as in relevance to children as individuals and to their community, to the cultural elements of their identity, and relationships, the relationships between people within a community, are kind of set aside so that rigor takes center stage. And a lot of times this rigor, again, it's kind of false, imposed, and not particularly useful for kids in a given community. So we've got all these pedagogical complications as a result. There's a struggle between student-centered methodologies and society-centered ones. Towards the middle of the 20th century, a lot of people working in cognitive science and so forth began to try to feed into education the notion of student-centeredness, the notion of what's appropriate for children at particular moments in their development. And they have been pushed back against by people who are more structuralist, who are thinking about society and see schools as creating citizens and workers and so forth, rather than helping human beings to develop as individuals. There has been historically in Mexico with indigenous children, and in the US with lots of ethnic minorities, the segregation of children, sometimes for academic reasons or linguistic reasons, but ultimately they are societal reasons that are about control, about taking those communities that I say have different local funds of knowledge and trying to force them into a society system. There is what we call conservative instructional inertia, which means that teachers tend to teach the way they were taught, despite whatever training they may have gotten. The way they were treated as children is what they have internalized and then perpetuate. Similar to this is technological lag. The older you get, the less likely you are to adopt and become fluent in the most recent technologies. And as technological advancement, it goes faster and faster and faster, we find teachers who tend to be older adults unable to keep up with the technology that their students are using and unable to find ways to utilize it in the classroom. There's also just a real ignorance because of not keeping up with the latest research and so forth of advances in cognitive science with teachers and school administrators. The cultural homogeneity that I was talking about before what it does is it creates these apparent achievement gaps. In the United States, like Anglo-Saxon kids tend to perform better, especially middle-class ones, on standardized tests, and so do Asian Americans, than Latino Americans or Black Americans or other groups like Indigenous and so forth. And that gives an apparent misunderstanding of the success of white children, rather than being analyzed as a problem with the system that is tailored to the needs of white children and not to the other children. And that's the trap of standardized testing. Standardized testing doesn't really give us a clear picture of students' mastery of knowledge and skills. Instead, it shows us how well students can take tests that are culturally keyed to a particular group. And then generally, the other pedagogical complications are this reliance on outdated and ineffective structural systems, classroom setups with desks and rows, in these square or rectangular rooms with particular student teacher ratios that put way too many students dependent on a single teacher during a particular hour. And we've been teaching the disciplines, mathematics, science, social studies, language arts, in isolation for so long that we've just assumed that that's the way they ought to be taught. And there's no real analysis of whether we should perhaps be integrating those disciplines or dividing them in different ways. And so the pandemic has really made clear the severity of these issues, because once you cut students off from the physical setting and force teachers who are not keeping up with technology to have to use technology to impart lessons, a lot of these issues that people were able to ignore are no longer they're no longer invisible to people, no matter how much they want to ignore them. In the United States, the last year was a challenge for so many teachers, and so many schools had to rush to make adaptations. And now that we're beginning to emerge, although with the Delta variant and other issues in the United States, there's like this real intransigence about getting vaccinated. That's very disturbing and destructive to the project of educating children. We are kind of emerging from it, and we're beginning to see that there are things that we started doing in the pandemic that we ought to continue doing, because students are just better served by that. So one of the first ones is this no longer relying on traditional systems. There is no reason for us to sit students in rows for hours on end, making them all be simultaneously attentive on a teacher, on a lesson. There's no real reason for us to impose dress codes on those children so that they come to school and they're, it's kind of like a quasi business or corporate system. There's no reason for us to have a single instructional methodology for all of those kids. And teachers who tried to use Zoom and other platforms just to recreate a physical classroom were very unsuccessful during the pandemic. And it was the teachers who discovered new ways of deploying their lessons in like modular ways that didn't require synchronous attendance of a Zoom meeting were the ones who discovered freedom and better success for their students, right? We don't have to force children to go through whole group instruction. We have many other tools to impart knowledge to them. The other thing that became very clear with the pandemic is that our existing assessment mechanisms, multiple choice tests, raising your hand to answer a question in class and so forth, are just inadequate. That we, as people have been saying for decades now, we really have to move towards what are called performance assessments, where students are actually creating something or doing something that shows an integrated mastery of multiple skills and knowledge, rather than their ability to answer questions on a multiple choice test. And we have all the tools we need electronically to create portfolios and keep track of those things. Students are able to upload videos of themselves, and this is, frankly, the TikTok generation. And students are really, really well versed in performance. Performance is an integral part of their lives now, and so for us not to take advantage of those things is for us to miss the importance of students being able to do something with what they learn from us. Another thing that we've been thinking about for the longest time, but just people have been reluctant to face, is the fact that children need individualized instruction, and that the best way to do that is through modular instructional tracks, where they get to decide the pacing and the structure of their learning, and giving them that flexibility and giving them that participatory role in their own education it's the next wave. It's frankly the way we need to go. But it's going to require like rethinking the role of the teacher, and so that the teacher is more of a facilitator, somebody who manages and coaches instruction rather than doling out instruction, pouring it into students' brains, right? And again, these are not things that are particularly new. Paulo Freire was talking about these things 70 years ago, for example, but it is not something that we can no longer pretend isn't true, and we can no longer allow the education system to exist, centuries in the past. And finally, and this is something that's really, really important to me, is that we need to start moving away from large, federally micromanaged provincial school systems to something that is a little more community-based. So a lot of us are beginning to think of something that has arisen during the pandemic, where you would have, because everybody was online, you would have mothers and fathers in a particular neighborhood band together, so that part of the day the students would be all together in one person's house to do certain types of activities together, and then they would go back to their homes for their modular online instruction at other times. And something like that, where you have local clusters of learners that are managed by communities or neighborhoods, will allow the kinds of tweaks to education that should minimize the achievement gap, because the achievement gap comes from the cultural ethnic homogeneity of the school system. And if we're able to give communities partial ethnic and cultural autonomy, allow them to feed into a system that is still overseen by the federal government or the provincial government, elements of the local funds of knowledge and values and so forth of the communities in which these schools are embedded, then students are going to see more relevance in the instructional content to their lives and to their roles in those communities, where they very likely are going to continue. And there's this idea in American education that you're educating students so they can go off to college in some distant place and then go live elsewhere and have different lives, when in reality most of the students are going to remain in the community. And so we need, education to understand that reality and to begin to integrate it into education. And then finally, school needs to have a heavy online component. There's no reason to force children into a building 8 hours a day. We should have a lot more of it online, with the physical in-person interaction being a little more focused and a little more infrequent than it has been in the past. And so, with these kinds of things in mind, I'm actually really, really excited about the direction in which we're going. When someone has said in the chat this idea of thinking about a particular nation or community and developing curricula that are specific to the needs of those people, I think that is really, really valuable. again, in a pluralistic society like, like many countries in Europe and the US and so forth, that can't be a single federal system. It's got to be something a little more modular. Different nations will have different needs depending on what that intermix is. But I still think that moving towards a modular, less federally overseen system with still checks and balances to ensure that students' needs are being met is the wave of the future. And so, I really appreciate your time and listening to some of these ideas. I wish you all the best in the conversations that you're going to have and the pitching and so forth. And you can find me online if you ever need to shoot me an email. I have a website. It's just my name, davidbulls.us. I'll type it into the chat. I'm always happy to field any questions that people have and engage in dialogue. So don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I invite our participants to turn on your video and microphone. And if you have questions, you can write them in the chat or ask directly, because I have several questions actually. And do you have some time to stay with us a little bit longer? Great. Yes. Okay. If you need to go, please.
No, I'm fine. I'll stick around. Yes.
Super, because I also observe what comments we have in the chat, and also I want to bring perspective of this partnership, because our participants worked on developing idea in order to have this partnership between different countries. So my question is how we can combine these different needs of our country or even local communities, and also take into consideration these interconnections. Or probably you can share with us some good examples, good practices of international projects probably in this sphere.
Absolutely. One of the things that happens where I live is partnerships between school districts on the US side, because again, I live literally on the border with Mexico, and the more federally driven school system in Mexico. I have presented multiple times at there's a school called the Oxford School in the town of Reynosa, which is right across the border from McAllen, which is the major city nearby, that has teamed up with the school on the McAllen side. And as sister schools, the students do projects together virtually. They read books together. They study, because the students on the US side are Mexican American mostly, and then the students on the Mexican side are obviously Mexican. They do projects where they find their commonalities and where they explore their differences. It's usually literature based. There's lots of reading and writing involved in the activities they do. This holds true also of superior education. So at the university where I teach has relationships with the university just right across the river in Tamaulipas, and often we'll do guest lecture visits either virtually or in person to the university on the other side. And this is one of those like rich things that you can do in borderlands, where you can physically be in the same place. The two public schools, we get the students once a year to come together at a library, either on the US side or on the Mexican side, to do a celebration, and we'll bring in an author to talk to the students and so forth. And like I say, university professors can go back and forth. But just this is something you can do virtually as well. You can connect schools, and I think it helps to underscore the very different systems that exist, but the similarities in students' needs and their interests and so forth, globally. Because I've said a lot about like the needs of specific communities, but we are, after all, human beings, and we have universal needs and wants and interests that cut across community and national lines, and those kinds of collaborations are great.
Yeah, so thank you for such expired example. And as I understood, it's a combination, a hybrid format, combination of virtual work and physical exchanges or celebrations together. It's really great idea, and probably, at least here in Ukraine, sometimes we really forgot about these important components of any projects and any like collaboration. So, and because another my question was about this online fatigue. So what is motivation of these students to keep virtually, to stay online? So because it's really a big challenge now, to motivate
Sure, I
online.
think, yeah, Natalia, the online fatigue is a fascinating thing. One of the things we discovered is that the fatigue comes from the manner in which the instruction is being imparted, right? So the fatigue comes from being forced to be in a Zoom meeting with 30 other people, and having to follow the norms of a physical classroom in an online environment. Children themselves don't suffer from online fatigue when it has to do with what they're interested in, with the videos they watch, with the videos they upload, with the chats they do. Children are perfectly content, for the most part, to be online 6 to 8 hours a day without any problem. The fatigue comes from forcing a traditional physical model into the virtual world. They are incompatible. As adults, we know what this feels like. I don't want to be in any more meetings with 30 educators, and pretending like we're in a physical space. There are other ways of deploying information. Like, for example, if you're recording this video, there will be people who are participating who opt not to watch the video live, but to watch it later. That is, that's the kind of thing that we need to have, the flexibility of asynchronous, modular usage of education by children.
Yes, thank you very much for such insights, because I work also more with adult, but it's pretty like new things for me that yes, children
Yes.
doesn't suffer from online fatigue if you can do it in proper way. And here my next question, because changes need time, and it's another big challenge, because only I don't know, not a rather small number of teachers, for example, are ready for the changes, are ready for flexibility, are ready to learn totally new formats, totally new approaches. And educational system is pretty big, but here probably NGOs and non-formal education also can do something. So
I think that they can be leaders. They can, create models that are successful, that then inspire the more formal educational system to adapt some of those things. You're right in that there's no way to make this happen overnight. There's way too much, institutional weight. And it's very difficult to change, the inertia that comes from, decades and decades of doing something a certain way. And so it's something that will have to be implemented gradually. And that's why I think that smaller schools within schools, where you have like an academy within a school, where you pilot something like this, you try to do half the day online through modular self-paced kind of education, and then half the day physically in school. Or in the US, we have what are called charter schools that are outside of the public education system, that get special permission, a special license from the government to educate children in different ways, and there's usually smaller settings. Those kinds of things are what NGOs and smaller organisms can do to try out and promote and demonstrate the success of other models, that then may inspire provincial and federal governments to attempt something similar.
Yeah, so also this way of probes in such a complex world, that we can do. And dear participants, if you have another question, please write, or you can turn on your microphone. It will be great to have you here as well. And I have my last question. You mentioned that regarding this community, that my question is how to motivate people contribute to this local community, to their local communities after the university, because we also have some program in a rural area, and we like educate, provide some program of non-formal education, but at the same time we ask ourselves how we can motivate these people, our participants, to contribute after they learn in university. So yeah, what you can say?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've done in school districts where I've worked here in South Texas is to have you establish a school community relations like board that has like representatives of particular businesses in the community, like these are usually small towns, so like the owner of the local supermarket, you know, the somebody who runs an insurance company and so forth, the chief of police, and you create opportunities once a month for people from different businesses or different community organisms to come into school and give talks to students. So for example, there might be a science class that's studying plants, and you ask a local herbalist. In the Mexican American community, there are these stores that sell herbs for like traditional teas and medicines and so forth. And so you might ask the owner of those, are called yerberias, yerberia, to come into the science classroom and talk about herbs from a traditional perspective and the different types of teas that can be made from different plants and flowers and so forth, and what they treat. These opportunities for community interface with schools, they take time to develop. You have to reach out, you have to knock on doors and send emails and call people up, but you can establish a team that facilitates that interface. And we've seen it work really well. And you want it to be a regular thing. Some schools will have a career day once a year where they have people come in and talk, but it needs to be something more regular than that. You want those people to come in. And so one of the things that we discovered is when you start asking people in the community to participate and show respect for their knowledge and what they can bring to the school, they rise to the challenge. They are ready for that. And so when I can see in like a rural education program, we call it continuing education in the United States, when you're teaching adults new skills, whatever. In a continuing education system, I can see integrating into that a call to action to get those people, now that you've gone through the system, can you come to our schools now and share with the children some of these things? And I think that something like that could be valuable. I really do believe that one of the stumbling blocks, one of the barriers for children, is when they don't see people from their community in the textbooks, in the classrooms. To them, it feels like you're teaching them about other people. They're like, nobody from my little rural community in South Texas or Ukraine is a scientist or a writer. Why would I can't be one either. And so to stop that self-judgment, you have to give them examples from the community of people who are doing things.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy because I was able to ask my main challenges for the last year. So I'm pretty sure that for our participants, it also will be so useful for their project ideas. Also, I see already some comments in the chat. Yes, thank you also that you share your story. Yes, that already you see outcomes for this regular work with teachers. And I think it's the last chance to ask your question. We will give you one last minute. And sorry, I interrupt you. Did I interrupt you?
No. It's been a pleasure, Natalia, and I'm excited at the work that these groups are doing, and I wish them the very best. And like I say, anybody who wants to reach out to me and has questions. Sometimes questions don't occur to you at the moment, but they occur to you later on. Like, oh, I should have asked him whatever. You can also just email me. I'll put my email address in the chat, and I am happy. This is not my university email. It's my personal email, the one I use as an author. I'm happy to answer your questions. So think of me as a resource, and feel free to reach out.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.